So I'm gonna start by sharing. You can see it, right?
Yes, yes.
Yes, we can. Yes.
Very good.
Hello, Andre.
Yes.
And you can hear me, yeah? Good, very good.
Yes, Tony,
Yes.
all is clear.
Great. So again, this is only an introduction in general about the Middle East. As I said, there are going to be at least 5 webinars to go in details in what happened the past 120 years, what happened in the late 19th century and beginning of the 20th century in the land. We're going to cover a few details, the Turkish period, the British period, the Jordanian period, the Israel period, all the way until today. So at least 5 detailed webinars on every period. But I want to explain or start by explaining that the conflict that is here, found here, is not an ancient conflict, as many people think. It is only a new conflict. It's only for the past 100, 120 years, as I said. And this land, this whole land here was part of a larger region that includes present-day Jordan, Syria, Lebanon, all of which together were called Bilad Isham, or the country of the Levant, where Damascus functioned as the administration capital of all this area. So there was still no Jordan, no Lebanon, no Egypt, no Iraq. It was all called Bilad al-Sham, the Levant, or the area of the Levant. And Damascus was the administrative capital. Now, here in the Middle East, you have to know that Jews, Christians, and Muslims, in the past 100, 120 years, we lived all in this region in peace together, generally. We were not fighting each other in this land. So the Middle East was generally a peaceful place, whereas wars were found more often in Europe and in other countries at that time. Since Arabs and Jews, like we, coexisted in peace for many centuries, now there is no reason on earth, no historical reason as well, at least, why they should not continue to live as good neighbors in the future. Now, please know that the Arabs were not the enemies of the Jews. And on the contrary, they were the ones who accepted them back to come to the land throughout history when they were suffering in many parts of the West. Now, for example, in the 7th century, when the Muslims came here, they are the people who allowed the Jews to come and live back in Jerusalem after the Romans literally kicked them out as they kept on revolting against them. But with Omar ibn Khattab in the 7th century, he allowed the Jews to come back and live in Jerusalem. So the Muslims were the people who first allowed the Jews to come and live here in the land. And they lived in peace since ever. Now, again, it's very important for every person to know at least a sketch of this land's history. And to do this, we're gonna look like from a bird's eye view of the modern history of this land together. And a good place to start if we want to understand about how the Arab-Israeli conflict developed is the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 12th century, as I said. So many of these events led to the important circumstances that we are living with in our modern period, whether bad or good. Today's present is so much affected by the decisions that took place in the past. We will try together to open a small window in this modern history for the past 100, 120 years in order to understand the roots of the Arab-Israeli conflict. Now, it is not easy to understand this today if we don't have a little background of what took place in our unfortunate past. So we need an overall perspective in order to understand what is happening at this time. To be able to understand better the conflict today, it is important to know these events that happened in the past. Now, the Christians of the land, we found ourselves somehow in the middle of the conflict that developed over the past years. So again, a webinar, we're going to talk about the Ottoman Empire and the rise of the Zionism. Another webinar, we're going to talk more about the British Mandate and what happened here. And then more about the Israel-Jordanian period between 1947 and 1967, and the Israel period from 1967 and today. And will be a fifth webinar that will help us better understand the conflict if we understand the events that happened in the past 100, 120 years. Now, it is easy to take sides, but being a pro-Christians without taking a side is probably the most difficult view to take. Now, it is not easy to avoid compromising our beliefs because everyone wants to know what side we are on and what side we are taking. But as Christians, I believe we need to take a larger view, right? So we will need to understand the conflict from more than one side, neither having a pro-Palestinian or a pro-Israeli side. Now, you may call this land whatever you like, the land of Canaan, the promised land, the Holy Land, Israel, Palestine, the land in between. I call it the land of God. Despite all challenges as well, I still call it home, though I don't feel home. But this is where I was born, where I live, and where I will stay. So I'm not going anywhere else because I love my land and I love all the people of this land, whether Jews, Christians, or Muslims. So for the Jews, they call the land Israel. For the Muslims, they call the land Palestine. All right. So we have Palestine, Israel, Palestine, Israel. And if you take the first letter of those words, you get PP land. Sorry for the word, and I'm not disrespecting the land, but as long as everyone remains selfish, this land will always be the PP land. Now, what I mean, why I do call it the PP land? Because literally, the Israelis will park their car along the road, and though there are nearby toilets or gas stations, they choose to take a PPE on the side of the road in front of everyone. I don't know who those who came here to the land, I see it on every tour. Whereas Muslims also have no problems throwing cigarettes or garbage outside the window of their car instead of waiting to find a trash can as normal civilized person would do. They all only think of themselves and don't respect others, thinking they are entitled to do what they want. This is only one small example to start with. Now, we the Christians have lived in the land for centuries, but no one can understand the behavior of people who only think of themselves and their own well-being. Actually, this is only the work of God that he planned his love in us, to love both the Jews and the Muslims, even to love the people who hurt us as well. So there's no single Christian who was not hurt by a Jew or by a Muslim in the land here. Now, as you can see, this land is not wide, neither long, but I assure you, it is very deep, all right? It is saturated with history. And I always like to tell my tourists this, like in this part of the world, the ocean here is not an ocean, actually. It is a sea, the Mediterranean Sea, that is open to the ocean, but we call it an ocean, though it is a sea. Even more than that, our sea, the Sea of Galilee, is not a sea, it's a lake, all right? But we call it the Sea of Galilee. Also, the river is not a river, it is a brook. Now, the Jordan River is neither wide nor deep. It is only a creek, but we still call it a river. And our mountains even are not really mountains. It is a hill. We don't really climb mountains here. Also, a well is not really a well. It is more of a cistern that only fills up by 1/3 during the year when it rains. What else? Like a highway is not a highway, it is a road, which means everything is modest in this country, and we do not have many valuable natural resources. There is no gold here, there is no diamonds, and no oil. The only oil we have is olive oil, actually. But we have a lot of stones everywhere. Soft white limestones, hard black basalt stones, large stones, small stones, a lot of stones. Now, my point is, like, although everything is small and modest in the Holy Land, except its people, all right? And we have, like, our land is saturated with history. We have the richest history in the whole world. And so many Eastern and Western cultures were formed here. And why is that? Why is that? So the Holy Land has been a buffer zone for all sorts, resting between ancient empires and the crossroads of the ancient world. So the Holy Land, as you can see, lies on the western edge of the Asian continent and the eastern extremity of the Mediterranean Sea, south of Europe, north of Africa. So it is a land bridge between Europe, Asia, and Africa. And in the ancient times, travel was conducted mostly on foot. Now, it would take a long time to get from one place to another place, unlike today. But in ancient times, there were 3 barriers to travel. There is the mountain barrier, which is very tiring to go up and down mountains like Mount Carmel. But the mountains were often like hideouts for bandits, and so we're often more dangerous too. Then we have the sea barrier, and only like until the Phoenician and the Greeks can, like, typically everyone feared the sea. But the Phoenicians were the first seafarers to travel the sea. Then we have the desert barrier here from the west. And lack of water in the desert, traveling across was very dangerous. So people can carry out water for a week, but if they didn't find another source, like, death was inventable. So the only natural way was along the Fertile Crescent, along this land bridge of the Holy Land, right? So people would avoid the mountains, people would avoid the sea, people would avoid the desert. So we became as a natural buffer zone, as a natural land bridge between the empires. So the only natural way was along the Fertile Crescent, along this land bridge of the Holy Land. So in ancient times, they didn't have the internet or modern communication. All they had were trade routes, international trade routes. In times of peace, this land would prosper because of the trade, but in times of war, it was the first land to be destroyed by armies seeking to control these trade routes to and from their homeland. Especially we'll talk about, like, the Mesopotamia, the land between the 2 rivers. These are the big empires. Egypt, the Nile, the longest dynasty through all history. we are here nothing. We are very small. Maybe some springs of water. So there were two main international trade routes in ancient times. So the main international trade route that ran from Egypt, from the Nile River in the south, traveling east to Mesopotamia, the land between the two rivers of the Tigris and the Euphrates, provided the quickest lines of communication between these regions, known as the Via Maris, or the Way of the Sea. It was the main trade route. Now today, like Highway number 6 in Israel, follows much of the same route as the ancient trade route between actually the mountains and between the sea, traveling in the middle. And it was much like M1 for England and Route 66 for the Americans. But there was another north-south trade route, the King's Highway along Transjordan, but it was drier and so was not used as much. Therefore, any imperial traffic between the ancient empires all have to pass through our land. So controlling these trade routes meant you control the communication between Africa, Europe, and Asia. And by extension, they controlled the trade of natural resources between these continents. So it is no wonder that God chose Abraham to come to this land and to be a light for all the nations, because he believed in the superior God who was above all the other gods. So unlike Egypt and Babylon, both of which have major rivers to provide water needed to grow food, the land of Canaan here has no reliable water sources. Here people were dependent on seasonal rain until today. Therefore, the most important god of the region was the storm god, Baal, who brought these rains. So we depend on God for our water, or the god of the weather that was worshipped here at that time, in ancient time. And the only thing we have in abundance, as I mentioned earlier, are stones that have witnessed God's work through all history. But sadly, the people here who live here, their hearts are hard like these stones. But God has always provided. Despite its smallness and lack of natural resources, God made this land strategically important. He made it a focal point of all the empires throughout history. And no wonder God chose this little piece of land to be glorified in it. Now, a big God who created the whole universe cares about little me out of the billions of people on earth. And we're not talking about like the people who already came and those who are still to come. So little with God is much. Now, I believe it is important to understand a bit of geography of the land so that we may understand better the history of the land. Because through all history, God has always used the small, the unrecognized, the unwanted, the little, the common to make the uncommon, and the natural to make the supernatural. And as I mentioned earlier, our location, like today we're bound to the north by Lebanon and Syria, to the east by Jordan, to the west by the Mediterranean Sea, and to the south by the Gulf of Aqaba and the Egyptian Sinai Peninsula here. So north, east, west, and south, this is from where the word news come, and that spreads to all over the world, despite like whatever happens here was very important in ancient times, affected the whole world in the ancient times. So there are three main geographical areas from north to south, because we are exactly in the middle, remember, in the middle of the Middle East. And we are also not rich in history only, but geographically we are very diverse within our small area. So we are home to a variety of geographical features And the three main divisions of the land is the coastal plain from north to south. Then we have the hill country or the central mountains in the middle. And then we have the Rift Valley or the Jordan River. So all is separated by short distances, but these areas are completely different from each other. We got it all here. We have the hills, we have the valleys, we have the desert, we have the forest. So it is a very unique land, as each region has its own distinctive landscape. And like a lot of historical events take place here for a reason, Now, again, like geography in a way shapes history. And to comprehend theology, we must understand the geography of the land as well, because from history also shaped the theology. So God, we see, always works through his creation, works through his people, works through his land. So as Christians, so it is important for us to understand where we stand and which stage we are on to help us to move forward and advance for the best is still to come. Since like Christianity is a linear religion, we have a beginning, we have an end. We should not move in circles, but knowing our position will help us in history, will help us understand where we should go and how to continue and how to advance forward. It's very important. So this like perspective of history is like an arrow that moves toward a target. So history has a direction and history has a meaning. So I believe history is his story. It's God's story of fusing this little, tiny, but important piece of land. Because again, little in God's hand is enough to start his redemption plan for the whole world. And because of this land, again, was very important through all history and still attracts people from the four corners of the earth. It's like a magnet. So caught up in the struggles of the present age, like we, the faithful, may not always be able to see the big picture, but there is one. So it's very important to understand this view of history as a linear view, because there is past, there is present, and there is future. So it doesn't matter whether it's in our job, in our relationship, or in our social or political issues, or in life, it is essential to know where we stand. So in order to grow, okay, we must first know where we are standing. And there are stages in life. So we need to know where we stand so that we know how we can move forward to the next level. Now, of course, the future is always a paradox. We cannot grow or change or achieve things in the future. We can only talk about the future, but we can plan for our future. We can dream about the future. We can only choose and do and grow and live in the present so that this will make us successful in the future. So to better engage in the present and try to do something meaningful today, and by choosing a little bit of meaning each day, we will find that the future does arrive. We will have done all that we possibly could to ensure that our future is one that we can feel good about. So even we are little, sometimes we are individuals, but it's really important to understand the land, to understand the conflict, because we can make an effect, though we are little and small, but still we can make an effect in God's plan. So we are all share like the same hopes and dreams. We have all the same fears and anxieties. So because all we have the same God. So we are all human. Doesn't matter Jews, Christians, or Muslim, because God knew what He was doing. All right. So God is behind all, right? So because we are also created in the image of God, so they had to be an intelligent design. So His plan have to be seen throughout history, and there is a direction for it all. So it is super important the way we understand history, and like out of the vastness of the universe, God still cares about us, about little humans, let's say, but very important in God's hands. Because we are eternal creatures, we always ask eternal questions. And I believe like we have to stand. Though we are a minority in the land here, but we have a major effect and role in God's work. I believe we are the keys that will open doors for His kingdom, but these keys need to be turned to unlock these gates and to reveal what is behind these gates. And every one of you is encouragement as well to help move these keys. So because we are the living stones, and these living stones are important, the Christians of all the world and the Christians of the land. So honestly, there is like enough suffering that inflicted on the human race by natural disasters and diseases, like the coronavirus that hit all humanity in 2020, 21, and 22, that we should all stop and think. We should spare the suffering we inflict upon each other so that we can preserve this universe and enjoy its resources, which are plenty for everybody's needs, but not enough for their greed, unfortunately. So this was just an introduction because it's really important to help you understand how history is important for us as Christians. And I'm gonna start the next webinar by talking more about the Ottoman Empire that ruled here for 400 years, and how at the end of its rule, it became an age of religious explosion. Like the words changed so much, and it became an age of political invention, an age of growing freedom and international trade and of urbanization. So really the whole world started to change in the last like 120 years. And then I'm gonna talk more about the birth of Zionism and how the early settlement started in the land. And like the Zionist movement was one of many European movements during these centuries. And back then, like these powers, European powers, started to build up and expand their presence here in the Holy Land, particularly through religious cultural penetration, including like the protection of the religious minorities. We're gonna talk more about it, how it's all started, with the French helping the Catholics, the Britain helping the Protestants, Russia helping the Greek Orthodox minorities in the land. But then, of course, the First World War shaped so much. The Turks, like, they allied themselves with Germany and Italy against Russia. And though, like, the war started in the West, but it ended here in our region. And the Holy Land, unfortunately, during the war, the conditions were harsh and the land regressed markedly here during the war, and it became even dangerous at some times. Then I'm gonna talk more about the Christian Arab society and the national awakening. Now, how the influence of the foreign missionaries and their introduction to education and access to foreign ideas and new standards and values, and that broaden the horizons of us as local Christians, especially the Arab Christians. We were more urbanized, we were more open to the Western ideas, and we're beginning to take part in Arab nationalism and politics and how it all started. So that will be our next Zoom webinar, where we're going to talk more about what happened in the Ottoman Empire, especially when it started to get weaker and weaker and weaker at the end of its reign, and how things started to change drastically here in our land, in our country. So again, thank you all for your time and listening, and you're welcome to unmute yourselves. And I hope you enjoyed this introduction of the land, of the history. I hope this added a little bit of information. But as I said, we're gonna go more in details of what happened here in every period of history.